I went into Oklahoma looking for snake lore, and I came out with a fear of snakes that will last me the rest of my life. I admit it's foolish, as there are natural explanations for everything I saw and heard, but it matters me nonetheless. If the old story had been all there was to it, I would not have been so badly shaken. My work as an ethnologist has hardened me to all kinds of extravagant legendary, but I can't forget what I saw with my own eyes at the asylum in Guthrie. I called it the asylum because a few of the old settlers told me I would find something important there. Neither indigenous nor white men would discuss the snake god legends I had come to trace, the oil-boom newcomers of old. They knew nothing of such matters, and old pioneers were plainly frightened when I spoke of them. Not more than 6 or 7 people mentioned the asylum, whispered that Dr. McNeil would know. He could explain why Yig, the half-human father of serpents, is a shunned and feared object in central Oklahoma, and why old settlers shiver at the secret orgies which make the autumn days and nights hideouts with ceaseless beatings of tom-toms in lonely places. It was with the scent of a hound on the trail that I went to Guthrie, for I had spent many years collecting data on the evolution of serpent worship. I had always felt that, from well-defined undertones of legend and archaeology, the great Quetzalcoatl, benign snake god, had an older, darker prototype. And during recent months, I had well-nigh proved in a series of researches stretching from Guatemala to the Oklahoma plains. But everything was tantalizing and incomplete, for above the border of the Gulf, the cult of the snake was a hedge of all the fears and all the furtiveness. Now it appeared that a new, copious source of data was about to dawn, and I sought the head of the asylum with eagerness I did not try to cloak. Dr. David McNeil, small, clean, his speech and manner that he was a scholar of no mean attainments and many branches outside his profession. Grave and doubtful when I first made known my errand, his face grew thoughtful, and he carefully scanned my credentials and the letter of introduction which a kindly old person, an agent, had given me. "So you've been studying the Yig legend, eh?" I know that many of our Oklahoma ethnologists have tried to connect it with Quetzalcoatl, but I don't think any of them have traced the intermediate steps so well. You've done remarkable work for a man as young as you seem to be, and you certainly deserve all the data we can give. I don't suppose old Major Moore and the others told you what it is I have here. They don't like to talk about it, neither do I. It's very tragic, very horrible, but that's all. I refuse to consider it anything supernatural. There's a story about it, and it'll tell you after you see it. A devilish, sad story. But one I won't dare call magic. It merely shews the potency that belief over some people. I'll admit there are times when I feel a shiver, more than physical. But in daylight, I set all that down. I'm not a young fellow anymore, alas. Come to the point. The thing I have is what you might call a victim of Yig's curse, a physical living victim. We don't let the bulk of the nurses see it, although most of them know it's here. There are 2 steady old chaps whom I let feed it, clean out its quarters. There used to be 3, but good old Stevens passed on a few days ago. I suppose I'll have to break in a new group pretty soon, but the thing doesn't seem to age or change much. We old boys, we can't last forever. Maybe the ethics of the near future will let us give it a merciful release, but it's hard to tell. Did you ever see that single ground glass basement window over in the east wing where you came up with the drive? That's where it is. I'll take you there myself now. You didn't make any comment. Well, look there. Just look through the movable panel in the door and thank God the light isn't any stronger. Then I'll tell you the story. or as much as I've been able to piece together. We walked downstairs very quietly, did not talk as we threaded corridors of the seemingly deserted basement. Dr. McNeil unlocked a gray-painted steel door, but was only a bulkhead leading to a further stretch of hallway. At length, he paused before a door marked B116, opened a small observation panel, which he could use only by standing on tiptoe, and pounded several times upon the painted metal, as if to arouse the occupant, whatever it might be. A faint stench came from the aperture as the doctor closed it, and I fancied his pounding elicited a kind of low hissing response. Finally, he moved me to replace him at the peephole, and I did so with casualness and increasing tremor. The barred, ground-glass window close to the earth outside admitted only a feeble and uncertain pallor, and I had to look into the malodorous den of several seconds before I could see what was crawling, wiggling about on the straw-covered floor, emitting every now and then a weak and vacuous hiss. Then the shadow outline began to take shape, and I perceived that the squirming entity bore some remote resemblance to a human form laid flat on its belly. I clutched at the door handle for support as I tried to keep from fainting. The moving object was almost human size, entirely devoid of clothing. It was absolutely hairless, and its tawny-looking back seemed subtly squamous in the dim, ghoulish light. Around the shoulders it was rather speckled and brownish. At the head was very curiously flat, and as it looked up to hiss at me, I saw the head, little black eyes were damnably anthropoid. But I could not bear to study them long. They fastened themselves on me with a horrible persistence, so that I closed the panel gaspingly, left the creature to wriggle about unseen in its matted straw and spectral light. I must have reeled a bit, for I saw that the doctor was gently holding my arm as he guided me away, and I was stuttering over and over again, asking what it was. Dr. McNeil told me the story in his private office as I sprawled opposite him in the easy chair. The gold and crimson of late afternoon changed to the violet of early dusk, but I still sat awed and motionless. I resented every ring on the telephone, every whir of the buzzer, and I could have cursed the nurses and interns whose knocks now and then summoned the doctor briefly to the outer office. Night came, and I was glad my host switched on all the lights. Scientist though I was, my zeal for research was half forgotten among such breathless ecstasies of fright as a small boy might feel when whispered witch tales. It seems that Yig, the snake god of the Central Plains, presumably the primal source of the southern Quetzalcoatl and Kulkan, was an odd, half-anthropomorphic devil of high arbitrary and capricious nature. He was not wholly evil. He was not usually quite well disposed toward those with proper respect to him and his children, the serpents. But in the autumn, he became abnormally ravenous and had to be driven away by the means of suitable rites. This was why the tom-toms played. The country pounded ceaselessly, week in, week out in August, September, and October. Why the medicine men, their strange noises and rattles and whistles, curiously like those of the Aztecs and Mayans, the same sound. Yig's chief trait was relentless devotion to his children. A devotion so great that the people almost feared to protect themselves from the venomous rattlesnakes which thronged the region. Frightful clandestine tales hinted of his vengeance upon the mortals who flouted him or wreaked harm upon him, wriggling progeny. His chosen method being to turn his victims, after suitable tortures, to a spotted snake. In the old days, the doctor went on, there was not quite so much secrecy about Yig. The plains tribes, less cautious than the desert nomads and pueblos, talked quite freely of their legends and autumn ceremonies with the first agents, and let considerable of the lore spread out through the neighboring regions. The great fear came in, the land rush of '89, when when some extraordinary incidents had been rumored and rumors sustained by what seemed to be hideously tangible proofs. They said that the new men did not know how to get on with Yig, and afterward the settlers came to take the theory at face value. Now, no old-timer in middle Oklahoma could be induced to breathe a word about the snake god except in vague hints. Yet after all, the doctor added with almost needless emphasis, the only true authenticated horror had been a thing of pitiful tragedy rather than a bewitchment. It was all very material and cruel. Even that last phase, which had caused so much dispute. Dr. Bisneal paused and cleared his throat before getting down to his special story, and I felt a tingling sensation when a theater curtain rises. The thing had begun when Walker Davis and his wife Audrey left Arkansas to settle in the newly opened public lands in the spring of 1889, and the end had come in the country of the Wichitas, north of the Wichita River, which is at present the Caddo country. There is a small village called Binger there now. The railway goes through, but otherwise the place is less changed than other parts of Oklahoma. It's still a section of farms and ranches, quite productive in these days, since the great oil fields did not come very close. Walker and Audrey had come from Franklin country, in the Ozarks, with a canvas-topped wagon, 2 mules, an ancient and useless dog called Wolf, and their household goods. They were typical hill folk, youngish and perhaps a little more ambitious than most, looked forward to life, better returns for their hard work when they had gone to Arkansas. Both were lean, raw-boned specimens, the man tall, sandy, gray-eyed, the woman short and rather dark, the black straightness of hair suggesting a slight change. In general, there was very little distinction about them. But for one thing, their animals might not have been different from those of the thousands of other pioneers who flocked into the new country at that time. That thing was Walker's almost epileptic fear of snakes, with some laid to a prenatal cause, and such came from a dark prophecy about his end, in which an old person told him had tried to scare him when he was small. Whatever the cause, the effect was marked indeed, for despite his local general courage, the very mention of a snake would cause him to grow faint, pale, and while the sight of even a tiny specimen would produce a shock, sometimes bordering on convulsions or seizures. The Daveses stated early on in that year that in the hope of being on their new land for the spring plowing, they should get to work. Travel was slow, the roads were bad in Arkansas, and while in the territory there were great stretches of rolling hills and red, sandy barrens without any roads whatsoever. As the terrain grew flatter, the changes from their native mountains depressed them more, perhaps than they had realized. But they found people at the agencies, very affable, and they were able to ask them questions and learn about the land. Owing to the season, there were not many snakes in evidence, so Walker did not suffer from a special temperamental weakness. In the early stages of the journey, too, there were no snake legends to trouble him, for the transplanted tribes from the southeast did not share their beliefs. As fate would have it, it was a man, an Omoki, in the Creek country who gave Davesies the first hint of Yig. A hint that had a curiously fascinating effect on Walker, caused him to ask questions very freely after that. Before long, Walker, fascinated, and developed into a bad case of fright. He took the most extraordinary precautions at each of the night camps, always clearing away whatever vegetation he found and avoiding stony places whenever he could. Every clump of stunted bushes and every cleft in the great slab-like rock seemed to him now to hide malevolent serpents, while every human figure not obviously part of the settlement of immigrants, the train seemed to him a potential snake god, till nearness had proved the contrary. Fortunately, no troublesome encounters proved. And as they approached the Kickapoo country, they found it harder and harder to avoid camping near rocks. Finally, it was no longer possible, and poor Walker was reduced to the puerile expedient of droning some of the rustic anti-snake charms he'd learned in his boyhood. 2 or 3 times a snake was really glimpsed, and these sights did not help the sufferer in his efforts to preserve composure. On the 22nd evening of the journey, a savage wind made it imperative, for the sake of the mules, to camp in a sheltered spot as long as possible, and Audrey persuaded her husband to take advantage of a cliff that rose uncommonly high above the dried bed of a former tributary of the Canadian River. He did not like the rocky cast of the place, but allowed himself to be overruled this once, leading the animals sullenly toward the protecting slope, while the nature of the ground would not allow the wagon to approach. Audrey, examining the rots near the wagon, meanwhile, noticed a singular sniffing on the part of the feeble old dog. Seizing a rifle, she followed its lead. Presently thanked her stars that she forestalled Walker in his discovery. For there, snugly nested in the gap between 2 boulders, was a sight it would not have done him no good to see. Visible only as one convoluted expanse, perhaps comprising as many as 3 or 4 separate units, was a mass of lazy wriggling, which could not be other than a brood of newborn rattlesnakes. Anxious to save Walker from the trying shock, Audrey did not hesitate to act, but took the gun firmly by the barrel and brought the butt down again and again on the writhing object. Her own sense of loathing was great, but it did not amount to real fear, and finally she saw that her task was done, and turned to cleanse the improvised bludgeon in the red sand and dried, dead grass nearby. She must, she reflected, cover the nest up before Walker got back from tethering the mules. Old Wolf, tottering relic of mixed shepherd coyote ancestry that he was, had vanished. She feared he had gone to fetch his master. Footsteps at that instant proved her fear well-founded. A second more, and Walker had seen everything. Audrey made a move to catch him if he should faint, but he did no more than sway. Then the look of pure fright was on his bloodless face, turned slowly to something that mingled awe and anger, and he began to upbraid his wife in a trembling tone. "God's sake! Why do you go for that? Hadn't you heard all these things they've been telling about Snake Devil? You'd ought to have told me and we'd have moved on. You know, he's a devil god who gets and hurts his children. What about? This land's a curse, I tell you. Nigh on every soul we've talked to since come in said, Yigs rule here. And he comes out every fall. Yigs rule here. God knows who you done to yourself, gal. Stop a stompin', hurl brew. He'll get you, sure, sooner or later. Less'n you can. A charm, injured medicine. He'll come out of the night, and he'll turn you into a crawling, spotted snake. All the rest of the journey, Walker kept up the frightened reproofs and prophecies. They crossed the Canadian rear near Newcastle, and soon afterward met with the first of the real plains. They taught poor Walker a long-winded protective charm against Yig in exchange for a quart bottle of the same inspiring fluid. By the end of the week, the chosen site in Wichita country was reached, and the Davises made haste to trace their boundaries and perform the spring plowing before even beginning the construction of a cabin. The region was flat, drearily windy, with sparse and natural vegetation, but promised great fertility under cultivation. Occasionally outcropping of granite diversified a soil of decomposed red sandstone. here and there were great flat rock. There seemed to be very few snakes, or possible dens for them. So Audrey at last persuaded Walker to build the one-room cabin over a vast smooth slab of exposed stone. With such a flooring and with such a good-sized fireplace, the wettest weather might be defied, though it soon became evident that the dampness was no salient quality of the district. Logs were hauled into the wagon in the nearest belt of woods, many miles toward the Wichita Mountains. Walker built his wide-eyed cabin and crude barn with the aid of some of the other settlers, though the nearest one was over a mile away. And in turn, he helped his helpers at similar house raisings, so that many ties of friendship sprang up between the new neighbors. There was no town worthy of the name nearer than El Reno, on the railway 30 miles more to the east. And before many weeks had passed, the people of the section become very cohesive despite the wildness of their scatterings. Of all the neighbors, the Davies found Joe and Sally Compton, who likewise hailed from Arkansas, the most helpful and congenial. Sally is still alive, known now as Grandma Compton, and her son Clyde, then an infant in the arms, had become one of the leading men of the States. Sally and Audrey used to visit each other often, for their cabins were only 2 miles apart, and in the long spring and summer afternoons they exchanged many a tale of old Arkansas and many rumor about the new country. Sally was very sympathetic about Walker's weakness regarding snakes, perhaps did more to aggravate the curse, the parallel nervousness which Audrey acquired in his incessant praying and prophesying about the curse of Yig. She was uncommonly full of gruesome snake stories, produced a direful of strong impressions, each one a masterpiece. The tale of a man in Scott County who had been bitten by a whole horde of rattles all at once, and had sweltered so monstrously from poison that his body had finally burst with a pop. Needlessly to say, Audrey did not repeat this anecdote to her husband. She implored the Comptons to beware of starting it on the rounds of the countryside. It is to Joe and Sally's credit that they heeded the plea with the utmost fealty, and the story was never heard again. Walker did his corn planting early, and in midsummer improved his time by harvesting a fair crop of the native grass of the region. With the help of Joe Compton, he dug a well, which gave a moderate supply of very good water, though he planned to sink an artisan later on. He did not run into many serious snake scares, and made his land as inhospitable as possible from wriggling visitors. Every now and then he rode over the cluster of thatched, conical huts which formed the main village of the Wichitas, and talked long with the old men and shamans about the snake god and how to nullify his wrath. Charms were always ready in exchange for whiskey, but much of the information he got was far from reassuring. Yig was a great god. He was bad medicine. He did not forget things. In the autumn his children were hungry and wild, and Yig was hungry and wild too. And all the tribes made medicine against Yig when the corn harvest came. They gave him some corn and danced in proper regalia, the sound of whistle and rattle and drum. And they kept the drums pounding to give Yig the opportunity to go away. Called down the aid, whose children men are, even as the snakes are Yig's children. It was bad that the squaw of Davies killed these people. Let Davies say the charms many times when the corn harvest comes. Yig is Yig. Yig is the great god. By the time the corn harvest did come, Walker had succeeded in getting his wife into a deplorably jumpy state. His prayers and burrowed incantations came to be a nuisance. When the autumn rites began, there was always a distant wind-borne pounding of tom-toms to lend an added background to the sinister. It was maddening to have the muffled clatter always stealing over the wide red plains. Why would it ever stop? Day and night, week on week, it was always going in exhaustless relays, as persistently as the red dusty winds that carried it. Audrey loathed it more than her husband did, for he saw in it a compensating element of protection. It was with this sense of mighty and tangible bulwark against evil that he got in his own corn crop and prepared cabin and stable for the coming winter. The autumn was abnormally warm. Except for their primitive cookery, the Daisies found scant use of the stone fireplace Walker had built with such care. Something in the unnaturalness of the hot dust clouds preyed on the nerves of all, the settlers, but most of all Audrey and Walker. The notion of a hovering snake curse, the weird endless rhythm of the distant drums, formed a bad combination, which any added element of the bizarre went far to render utterly unendurable. Notwithstanding the strain, several festival gatherings were held on one or another cabin after the crops were reaped, keeping naively alive in the modernity those curious rites of the harvest home which are as old as human agriculture itself. Lafayette Smith, who came from southern Missouri, had a cabin 3 miles east of Walker's, was a very passable fiddler, and his tunes did not much to make the celebrations forget the monotonous beatings of the distant tom-toms. Then Halloween drew near, and the settlers planned another frolic. This time they had known it, a lineage of older than even agriculture. The dread witch sabbath of the primal pre-Aryans, kept alive though, ages in the midnight blackness of secret woods, still hinting at vague terrors under the latter-day mask of comedy and lightness. Halloween was to fall on a Thursday. The neighbors agreed to gather for their first revel in the Davies cabin. It was on that 31st of October that the warm smell broke. The morning was gray and leaden, and by noon the incessant winds had changed from searingness to rawness. People shivered all the more because they were not prepared for the chill. The Walker's old dog Wolf dragged himself wearily indoors to place behind the heath. But the distant drum still thumped on. As early as 4 in the morning, the wagons began to arrive at Walker's cabin. And in the evening, after a memorable barbecue, Lafayette Smith's fiddle inspired a very fair-sized contemporary of great folks. Salutations. The younger folk indulged in this amiable inanimity proper to the season. And now and then, old Wolf, doleful and spine-tingling, would come up to them, strain on his neck while he played the squeaky violin. Mostly, though, this battered device he had never had before, staring at the violin. Zeke seemed strangely uneasy over something, nosed around curiously all the evening. Audrey and Walker made a fine couple on the floor. Grandma Compton still likes to recall her impression of their dancing that night. Their worries seemed forgotten for the nonce, and Walker was shaved and trimmed into a surprising degree of spruceness. By 10 o'clock, all hands were healthily tired, and the guests began to depart, family by family, with many handshaking and bluff assurances of what time everybody had. Tom and Jenny thought Zeke's eerie howls as he followed them to the wagon were marks of regret at having to go home, though Audrey said it must be far away from tom-toms, which annoyed him, for the distant thumping was surely ghastly enough for the merriment within. The night was bitterly cold. For the first time, Walker put a great log in the fireplace and banked it with ashes to keep it smoldering till morning. Old Wolf dragged himself within a ruddy glow and lapsed into the customary coma. Audrey and Walker, too tired to think of charms and curses, tumbled into the rough pine bed and were asleep before the cheap alarm clock on the mantel had ticked off 3 minutes. And from far away, the rhythmic pounding of those hellish tom-toms still pushed on. It was here that Dr. McNeil paused and removed his glasses. as if a blurring of the objective might make their reminiscent vision clearer. You'll soon appreciate that I had a great deal of difficulty in piercing out all that happened after the guests left. There were times, though, at first where I was able to make a try at it. After a moment, he went on with the tale. Audrey had terrible dreams of Yig, who appeared to her in the guise of Satan, as depicted in cheap engravings she had seen. It was indeed from an absolute ecstasy of nightmare that she started suddenly awake to find Walker, already conscious, sitting up in bed. He seemed to be listening intently to something, silenced her with a whisper, and when she began to ask why he was roused, well, he said he heard something, a singing, a buzzing, a rustling. He continued with the story. Certainly there was distinctly audible within the cabin such sounds as he had described. Audrey tried to analyze it, and was impressed with some elements at once horrible and familiar, which hovered just outside the rim of her memory. And beyond it all, waking a hideous thought, the monotonous beating of the distant tom-toms came incessantly across the black plains, to a half-cloudy, half-moon, half-set. She asked him, could it be the curse of Yig? She could feel him tremble. He said, no, gal. It doesn't come that way. It can't be. He continued with the story. He rose, felt for the lantern that hung within each reach, and rattled the tin matchbox nailed to the wall beside it. Audrey sat up in bed and watched the flare of the match grow into the steady glow of the lantern. Then as their eyes began to take the whole of the room, the crude rafters shook with the frenzy of their simultaneous shriek. For the flat, rocky floor, revealed in the newborn illumination, was one seething, brown-speckled mass of wriggling rattlesnakes, slithering toward the fire, and even now turning their loathsome heads to menace the fright-blasted lantern-bearer. It was only for an instant that Audrey saw the things. The reptiles were on every side, of uncountable numbers, and apparently of several varieties, and even as she looked, 2 or 3 of them reached their heads as if to strike Walker. She did not faint. It was Walker's crash to the floor that extinguished the lantern, plunged her into blackness. He had not screamed a second time, fright had paralyzed him, and he felt as if shot by a silent arrow from no mortal bow. To Audrey, the entire world seemed to whirl about fantastically, mingling with the nightmare from which she started. Voluntary motion of any sort was impossible, for will and the sense of reality had left her. She fell back inertly on her pillow, hoping that she would wake soon. No actual sense of what had happened penetrated her mind from some time. Then little by little the suspicion that she really awake began to dawn on her. She was convulsed with a mounting blend of panic and grief, which made her long to shriek out despite the inhibiting spell which kept her mute. Walker had gone. She had not been able to help him. He had died of snakes, just as the old witch woman had predicted when he was a little boy. Poor Wolf had not been able to help either. Probably had not been able to even be waked from the senile stupor. And now the crawling things must be coming for her, writhing closer and closer every moment in the dark. Perhaps even now twining slipperily around the headpost and oozing up on over the coarse woolen blankets. Unconsciously, she crept under the clothes and trembled. It must be the curse of Yig. He had sent his monstrous children on All Hallows Night, and they had taken Walker first. Why was that? Wasn't he innocent enough? Why not come straight for her? Hadn't she killed those little rattlers alone? And then she thought of the curse. She wouldn't be killed. Just turned to a spotted snake. So she would be like those things she had glimpsed on the floor, those things which Yig had sent to get her and enroll her among their numbers. She tried to mumble a charm that Walker had taught her, but found she could not utter a single sound. The noisy tickling of the alarm clock sounded above the maddening beat of the distant tom-toms. The snakes were taking a long time. Did they mean to delay on purpose? To play on her nerves? Even now, then, she thought she felt a steady, insidious pressure on the bedclothes. But each time it turned out to be only the automatic twitchings of her overwrought nerves. The clock ticked on in the dark, and change came slowly over her thoughts. Those snakes couldn't have taken so long. They couldn't be Yig's messengers after all. Just natural rattlers that were nested below the rock and had been drawn there by the fire. They weren't coming for her. Perhaps they had stated themselves on poor Walker. Where were they now? Gone? Coiled by the fire? Still crawling over the prone corpse of their victim. The clocks ticked, and the distant drums throbbed on. As the thoughts of her husband's body lying there in the pitch blackness of thrill, a purely physical horror passed over Audrey. The story of Sally Compton's about the man back in Scott County. He too had been bitten by a whole bunch of rattlesnakes, and what had happened to him? The poison had rotten the flesh, swelled the whole corpse. But in the end, the bloated thing was burst horribly with a detestable popping noise. Was that what was happening to Walker down there on the rock floor? Instinctively, she felt she had begun to listen for something, too terrible even to name for herself. And the clock ticked on, keeping a kind of mocking sardonic time with the far-off drumming that the night wind brought. She wished it were a striking clock so that she could know how long the eldritch vigil might last. She cursed the toughness of fiber that kept her from fainting, and wondered what sort of relief the dawn could bring, after all. Probably neighbors would pass. No doubt somebody would call. Would they find her still sane? Was she still sane now? Morbidly listening, Audrey all at once became aware of something which she had to verify with every effort of her will, before she could believe it, and which once verified, she did not know whether to welcome or dread. They had always maddened her, but had not Walker regarded them as a bulwark against the nameless evil from outside the universe? What were some of those things he had repeated to her in whispers after talking with Grey Eagle? She did not relish this new and sudden silence, after all. There was something sinister about it. The loud ticking clock seemed abnormal in these new loneliness. Capable at last of conscious motion, she took the covers from her face and looked into the darkness toward the window. It must have cleared out the moon. She saw the square aperture distinctly against the background of stars. Then without warning came the shocking, unutterable sound. That dull, putrid pop. Cleft skin, escaping poison in the dark. God, Sally's story. That obscure stretch. This gnawing, clawing silence, it was too much. The bonds of muteness snapped, and the black night waxed reverberant with Audrey's screams of stark and unbridled frenzy. Consciousness did not pass away with the shock. How merciful, if only it had. Amidst the echoes of her shrieking, Audrey still saw the star-sprinkled square of window ahead, and heard the doom-boding ticking of that frightful clock. Did she hear another sound? Was that square window still a perfect square? She was in no condition to weigh the evidence of her senses or distinguish between fact and hallucination. No. That window was not a perfect square. Something had encroached on the lower edge. Nor was the tickling of the clock the only sound in the room. There was, beyond dispute, a heavy breathing, neither her own nor poor Wolf's. Wolf slept very silently, and his wakeful wheezing was unmistakable. Then, Audrey saw against the black, demonic silhouette of something anthropod. The undulant bulk of a gigantic head, shoulders fumbling slowly toward her. And she yelled at it. She said, "Go away. Go away, snake devil. Go away, Yig." "I didn't mean to kill him," is what she told him. But to continue the story, the half-formless head and shoulders only lurched onward, toward the bed, very silently. Everything snapped at once inside Audrey's head. In a second, she had turned from a cowering child to a raging mad person. She knew where the axe was, hung against the wall on those pegs near the lantern. It was within easy reach. She could find it in the dark. Before she was conscious of anything further, it was in her hand. She was creeping toward the foot of the bed, toward the monstrous head and shoulders that every moment groped their way nearer. Had there been any light, the look on her face would not have been pleasant to see. She did the deed. She laughed shrilly, and her cackles mounted higher, and she saw the starlight beyond the window was yielding to the dim prophetic pallor of coming dawn. At this point, Dr. McNeil wiped the perspiration from his forehead, put on his glasses again, and I waited for him to resume. As he kept silent, I spoke softly. She lived. She was found. And was it ever explained? The doctor cleared his throat. "Yes, she lived. And, it was explained. I told you there was no bewitchment, only cruel, pitiful, material horror." It was Sally Compton, he said, who had made the discovery. She had ridden over the Davis cabin the next afternoon to talk over the party with Audrey, and had seen no smoke from the chimney, which is strange. It turned very warm again, yet Audrey usually cooking something at that hour. The mules were making hungry-sounding noises in the barn. There was no sign of old Wolf sunning himself in the accustomed spot by the door. Although Sally did not like the look of the place, so very timid and hesitant as she dismounted and knocked, she got no answer but waited some time before trying the crude door of split logs. The lock, it appeared, was unfastened. She slowly pushed her way in. Then perceiving what was there, she reeled back, gasped, clung to the jamb to preserve her balance. A terrible odor had welled out as she opened the door, but that was not what stunned her. It was what she had seen. Within the shadowy cabin, monstrous things had happened. 3 shocking objects remained on the floor to awe and baffle the beholder. Near the burned fireplace was the great dog. To the right of the door was the axe-hacked remnants of what had been a man, clad in a nightshirt, with the shattered bulk of a lantern clenched in one hand. He was totally free from any sign of snakebite. Near him lay the ensanguined axe, carelessly discarded. And wriggling flat on the floor was a loathsome, vacant-eyed thing that had been a woman, but was now only a mute, mad caricature. All that this thing could do was hiss, hiss, and hiss. Both the doctors and I were brushing cold drops from our foreheads by this time. He poured something from a flask on his desk, took a nip, handed another glass to me. I could only suggest, tumultuously and stupidly. So, Walker had only fainted that time. The screams roused him, and the axe did the rest. Yes, he must have met his death from the snakes just the same. It was his fear working in 2 ways. made him faint, and made him fill his wife with the wild stories that caused her to strike out again when she thought she saw the snake devil. And Audrey, wasn't it strange how the curse of Yig seemed to work itself out on her? I suppose the impression of hissing snakes had fairly grounded in her mind. Yes, there was a lucid spell at first, but they got to fewer and fewer. Her hair came white to the roots as it grew. Later, it began to fall out. Skin grew blotchy. When she died. Doctor, if she died, then what was that thing you showed me downstairs? That was what was born to her. 3/4 of a year afterwards. There were 3 more of them. 2 were even worse. But the one you saw is, luckily, the only one that lived.